Welcome. In addition to the participant-centered approach that was discussed in our last video, there are some other considerations when responding to trauma in our programs. And while the bulk of this video is to introduce our model of self and community nourishment, we're going to start with a brief overview of the 5 R's in SAMHSA's trauma-informed principles. In the Trauma Basics course, we looked closely at the different types of adversity present in our community. And this diagram should feel familiar, but it's a good reminder that highlights the various ways adverse experiences may shape a person's life. And the point of this diagram is not to suggest that every single adverse experience is going to result in an individual or a community trauma, but instead keep in mind that in the absence of protective factors and in cases of severe or repeated adversity, these are all events that can result in trauma at the individual and the community level. Additionally, food itself can be implicated in trauma. Many of us work with populations who've experienced food insecurity, which we know has long-lasting effects. The stigma and the shame associated with food assistance, with body size, with cultural food preferences, this needs to be considered when responding to trauma in nutrition interventions. And knowing that food does have such a complicated relationship with adversity and any related trauma helps us recognize traumatic adaptations, which, as you can see here, is the second step in the process. This topic was also addressed in the Trauma Basics course, but perhaps by now you've had some time to think about how this shows up. So once we realize that we're working in an environment with a lot of trauma, our next step isn't necessarily to jump to respond. The recognize step is not always intuitive. And most people, including most of us at Leah's Pantry, we're doers and responders. We want to help because if we know better, we want to do better. But recognizing is so important. It invites us to pause. It's an insertion of mindfulness into this process that's crucial. And recognizing invites us to listen, to watch, to learn from each other, and cultivating an attitude of humility in the face of others' experience is a lifelong practice, but one well worth practicing. Professionally, we must recognize what trauma can look like in the environments where we work. So in a food pantry, it could be unwelcome behavior by a client or a volunteer. In a nutrition class, it might be an argumentative or distracting participant. And in the community, it could be an unwillingness to visit a farmer's market because it's in a part of town viewed as off limits to a potential shopper. But as people and as professionals wanting to do trauma-sensitive work, we must respond. So SAMHSA has provided 6 principles that help guide our work of response. And that includes resisting re-traumatization and creating protective factors and healing practices. And instead of reviewing these 6 principles in depth during this part of the course, we're going to instead introduce our model of self and community nourishment. And the goal of our model has been to translate these 6 practices and principles into something more practical for community nutrition programs. And for those of you who've completed the Nutrition Pantry program training, you know we have a similar model for charitable food distributions as well. So if you're interested in taking a deeper dive into these 6 principles, I would encourage you to look at our more advanced nutrition security courses. Now let's build this model of self and community nourishment together. And this model is not intended to be rigid or prescriptive, but just a framework we've used to build programs, to test our programs for alignment with trauma-informed principles, and to connect programmatic elements to individual and community transformation. This is an extension of the first video of this section. How do we keep participants and their experience and growth at the center of our work? So you may be able to guess the first step because it's the first principle of SAMHSA's model for a reason. Safety and security. For classes and events, this is safety as defined by participants and staff or participating volunteers. And safety needs to be considered from several different perspectives. So is the physical space safe, warm, and welcoming? Does everyone feel safe here? Are there reasons where safety concerns would need to be considered? And sometimes safety conflicts with a desired instructional strategy. So, for example, if you're planning to deliver a cooking class with a group cooking element, something that you're thinking would be fun and joyful, but there's a lack of trust around hygiene among participants, then this activity may have to be revised in order to be more inclusive. And housing communities or congregate meal sites may have social cliques to be aware of. So planning events might require special outreach and classroom management to ensure social safety. If you're running a programming at a partner site, make space to uncover any potential issues during the planning stage of the programs by proactively asking questions of the site staff. Built on that foundation, we now identify programmatic elements that align with trauma-informed principles and with health and protective factors. Since we are assuming the universality of trauma in this model, this isn't necessarily about identifying or healing specific trauma, but it's about providing a space where everyone can deeply and authentically engage. So the first item on this row is identity and self-expression. And as discussed earlier, reducing food choices to a chronic disease prevention model runs the risk of minimizing individual preferences, of erasing cultural expression, and missing opportunities to incorporate personal and community history. And acknowledging the role of identity and self-expression at the outset of programs really keeps participants at the center, and it helps focus the attention of the programs in the right place. In our research and experience, individuals want to be known before they're ready to learn, and they want to learn information in a way that acknowledges their unique perspective. The second item on this row is positive experiences. Framing a nutrition class as an opportunity for joy, for laughter, and gratitude is a wonderful way to engage your creativity as an educator. And over the years, we've seen so many examples of how passionate and thoughtful educators have made small tweaks in this direction by playing music, by having a bouquet of flowers and nice tablecloths out, by incorporating thoughtful tastings. This doesn't have to be built into the curriculum you're using. Supportive relationships are part of the next element. So seeing your class as a cohesive group instead of a set of individuals is the first step. How can you create a supportive community in your classroom? And how can you leverage interactive activities like cooking to provide opportunities for peer-to-peer exchange and for relationship building? And you might be wondering when all the nutrition and physical activity comes in. Of course, it's here, and it's the reason why everyone is coming together in the first place. So aside from what we already talk about regularly, the role nutrition plays in our mental and physical health, it's also about adding in the role that nutrition and physical activity play in protecting us and in managing stress. This is a key addition to the content area. To call out stress management explicitly, because so many times our diet is impacted by stress, but we less frequently talk about how a nutritious diet can give us the stable energy we need to handle life's up and downs. So at the top level is when we start to look beyond the class itself and focus on the impacts on our participants or communities. And while we might create space for cooking in our class, we really hope to see participants who have basic culinary and food literacy, because confidence is built over time. So think about the difference between I watched the teacher make something, or with a little direction, I made a dish in class today, to I can cook for my family. It's really transformational. And the same with self-regulation. By providing mindfulness skills and regulatory activities in class, and we're going to touch on this quite a bit later, we hope to see participants increase their self-regulation skills outside the classroom. So modeling and practicing is the first step toward participant ownership over this skill. Another thing we know is protective and healing is being able to care for yourself and for others. In our evaluation of the Around the Table Youth Pilot, this was a theme that emerged repeatedly. Because one youth actually said she would text her sisters after class, some of the things that she had learned, and she really felt like she wanted them to be able to cook for themselves too. And she said they actually started doing some of the things that I shared with them. Think about how being a health champion for families is such a powerful outcome. And last, probably the biggest and most important impact. Can a trauma-informed structure to nutrition programming lead to a deeper understanding of the justice and equity issues that plague our food system and communities? So moving away from overburdening the individual and acknowledging social determinants is an important element. Just how this is done depends on a lot of different factors, but we believe there is great potential for this to be a more frequent conversation in community nutrition programs. And if you go through around the table training, you'll see many of these elements in both the class structure and the class content. So as we move up the framework, there's some blending between what's explicitly covered in class and what impacts we hope to see over time. One of these impacts, especially with regard to youth, is creating opportunities for leadership. So as youth develop these skills of autonomy and competency and self-regulation, they're better able to become resilient leaders, ready to tackle the thorny issues that complicate individual and communities' quests for health. Well, that's all I have for you. Thanks for watching.